future was draped upon her shoulders. A daughter no more when at last she stepped across the line, Isabel ceased to be a daughter of France. She was now Queen of Spain by law, by treaty, by ritual. Her father's banners no longer protected her. Her mother's embrace was now only a memory. The songs of Fontainebleau were silenced, replaced by the rigid etiquette of Madrid. She had been given away, like property, like a dowry. The theater of humiliation. Later chroniclers praised the ceremony as a symbol of peace between nations. They called it a triumph of diplomacy, a noble act of union. But to Isabel, it was a theater of humiliation, a public stripping of her identity, a ritual that made her body the stage upon which kingdoms congratulated themselves. And as the pavilion doors closed behind her, she stepped not into triumph, but into exile. Part 8. The long road south. When the pavilion doors closed, Isabel's new life began not in Madrid, but on the long road that led there. It was a journey of weeks, a slow descent from the green lands of France into the sun-scorched heart of Spain, and with each mile, her old world receded into memory. The caravan of queenship, her procession wound its way along narrow roads and over mountain passes. Horses stamped, wheels groaned, banners fluttered in the dry wind. To the villagers who gathered along the roadside, she was a vision of majesty, a girl wrapped in silks, seated in a gilded carriage. To Isabel herself, it was a moving prison. The curtains were drawn back so that all could see her, yet she had nowhere to hide. Every mile was another chain binding her to her fate. Mountains as walls. Crossing the Pyrenees was like crossing into another world. Behind her lay France, her childhood, her language, her laughter. Before her stretched Spain, harsher, drier, more solemn. The peaks rose like walls, shutting her off from everything she had known. When she looked back, the mists of the north seemed to swallow the land of her birth. Ahead, the southern sun beat down, relentless. There was no return. Whispers in the carriage. Isabel traveled with her new attendants, Spanish ladies in waiting assigned to her by Philip's court. Their speech was rapid, their manners unfamiliar. She struggled to follow their conversations, clinging to the few words of Castilian she had learned. Sometimes they smiled at her politely, sometimes they fell silent, as if speaking in her presence were a burden. The laughter of her French companions was gone. The carriage felt colder for it. Crowds along the way in towns and villages, people gathered to see her pass, bells rang, flowers were strewn, priests intoned blessings. They shouted words of welcome she could scarcely understand. To them, she was a queen, already a figure of destiny, a symbol of hope. To her, the cheers were muffled, distant, as though they were for someone else entirely. She waved as custom demanded, but inside she felt only the ache of exile. Bites of silence. The road was long, the days exhausting. At night, she lay in chambers prepared hastily in castles or monasteries along the route. She clutched her rosary in the darkness, whispered prayers through. Each morning she rose, dressed in her heavy Spanish gowns, and climbed back into the carriage. The journey never ended. The road itself seemed endless, and exile stretched across miles. Letters never sent. She began to draft letters to her sisters, to her mother, to her father, letters she never finished, never sent. How could she put into words what she felt? That every mile seemed to erase her. That each village cheering her name only reminded her how far from home she was. She folded the pages and tucked them away, the ink blurred by her tears. The long road south, so she traveled on, day after day, week after week. The procession moved like a slow river of silks and banners, winding ever deeper into Spain. The road itself was a kind of exile, a passage from one life to another. At its end waited Madrid, and a husband twice her age. But in the long days of travel, Isabel learned the cruelest truth of all. Exile does not begin with departure, nor with arrival. It begins with the journey. Part 9. A stranger in a strange land. The long road south ended at last in the beating heart of Spain. The bells of Madrid rang out as the French princess entered the city that would now be her home. To the crowds, it was a festival. To Isabel, it was a descent into strangeness. The city of silence, Madrid, was unlike Paris, unlike Fontainebleau, unlike anything she had known. Its streets were narrower, its houses severe, its air heady with dust and heat. The city lacked the gaiety of France, the music of fountains, the laughter of gardens. Here silence reigned, the silence of power, of watchful eyes, of a court that measured every word and every glance. Even the cheering of the crowds sounded muted, quickly swallowed by the rigid solemnity of Spanish ceremony. The first glimpse of Philip at last, Isabel was brought before her husband-to-be. Philip Roman II, King of Spain, stood waiting in the Hall of Realms. He was more than twice her age, his face lined with cares, his expression unreadable. His black garments made him seem more shadow than man. His eyes dark, piercing studied her not as a father might study a daughter, but as a sovereign inspects a jewel. Isabel, barely 14, bowed as she had been taught, her body trembling beneath the weight of his gaze. In that moment, she understood. She was not meeting a husband. She was meeting a king. The alien court, the Spanish court, surrounded her, a forest of black gowns, stiff collars, and solemn faces. They watched her every move, whispering in a tongue she could barely follow. She had been trained for this, but training was not enough. Each curtsy felt uncertain, each phrase of Castilian stumbled from her lips. Her mistakes were noted, her silences misread. The court smiled politely, but their eyes were cold. To them she was not Isabel, the laughing child of France. She was La Reina de España, a vessel of alliance, a foreigner to be judge. The marriage performed, the marriage was celebrated swiftly, with grandeur and ceremony. Priests intoned blessings, nobles exchanged oaths, the kingdom rejoiced. Isabel stood silent as vows were placed upon her. She scarcely understood the words, but the meaning was clear. She belonged now to Philip. The crown pressed upon her head was heavier than any chain. A stranger in her own skin from that day forward, even her name was altered. No longer Isabel of Valois, she was Isabel de la Paz, Queen of Spain. Her letters bore a new signature, her speech a new tongue, her life a new obedience. She was praised for her beauty, her grace, her youth. Yet beneath the silks and jewels, she felt hollow, as though her very self had been traded away at the border. She was not at home in Madrid. She was not at home in her marriage. She was not at home in her own skin. The shadow of Philip Roman too was courteous, even kind in his way. Yet he remained a distant figure, a man of prayer and paperwork, more wedded to his empire than to his bride. He spoke little, he smiled rarely. His presence filled the room with a weight that smothered Isabel's words before she could speak them. To be his wife was to live in his shadow, to orbit his silence. A stranger in a strange land, and so the French princess found herself in the heart of Spain, surrounded by ceremony, cloaked in foreign silks, bound to a man she barely knew. The city hailed her as queen, but in her heart she remained a stranger in a strange land, bound by chains that no one could see, chains written in treaties, fastened in vase, sealed by silence. Part 10. Fortress of Shadows. Isabel had crossed the frontier, spoken her vase, and worn her crown. But her true captivity began not on the road, nor at the altar, but inside the walls of Philip's court. Madrid was not only a city of stone, it was a fortress of shadows. The Palace of Silence, the royal palace, towered above the city, its walls thick, its corridors endless. Within them silence reigned. Servants moved like ghosts, courtiers whispered behind fans, every word weighed, every gesture noted. The air itself seemed heavy, pressing upon the chest, making breath shallow. The laughter of Fontainebleau was gone. In its place was ritual, hierarchy, suspicion. Here, even a smile could be misinterpreted. Even a sigh could be reported. The machinery of etiquette life at court was governed by rules as rigid as iron. At dawn, Isabel was dressed not in privacy, but in the presence of attendants who recorded every detail of her toilette. Every meal was a performance. Every visit to chapel was a procession. Each step of her day was dictated by custom older than herself. To disobey was unthinkable. To falter was dangerous. She learned quickly that freedom did not exist in Madrid. Only form. Eyes in the dark, Isabel felt herself watched at all times. Courtiers studied her, searching for faults, whispering judgments. Ambassadors reported on her words, her health, her demeanor, carrying their observations back to Paris, to Rome, to every corner of Europe. Even the walls seemed to have ears. Trust was a luxury she could not afford. The fortress was not built of stone, it was built of eyes. The queen's loneliness in this world of shadows. Isabel was desperately alone. Her French tongue, once her refuge, now set her apart. Her Spanish attendants bowed and smiled, but their hearts belonged to Philip, not to her. Her sisters were gone, her mother distant, her childhood vanished. The gardens of Fontainebleau might as well have been another world. She wrote letters, filling them with polite phrases, careful not to betray her sorrow. But in the spaces between the lines, one could almost see the tears. Philip's presence, her husband, Philip, came and went like a specter. When he was near, the air seemed to tighten. He spoke little, prayed much, worked endlessly. To Isabel, he was both protector and jailer. His approval meant safety, his displeasure danger. Yet he was too distant to know her, too burdened with empire to ease her solitude. She lived in his house, beneath his gaze, yet apart from his heart. A fortress without escape, the palace was her home, but also her prison. Its walls protected her, but they also confined her. Its rules shaped her, but they also suffocated her. Day by day, the fortress closed around her. She smiled when expected, bowed when commanded, prayed when required. But inside, she felt herself fading, becoming a shadow among shadows. Fortress of shadows. Thus Isabel of Valois, daughter of France, Queen of Spain, lived within the fortress of shadows. The world saw her as a queen adorned in jewels, seated beside the most powerful monarch of Europe. But she herself knew the truth. She was a girl, a stranger, locked in a palace where light itself seemed to bow before silence. Part 11. The Wedding of Chains. The bells of Madrid rang with joy, but for Isabel of France the sound was a funeral toll. She was 14 years old, dressed in silks heavy enough to break her shoulders, walking not toward freedom, but toward captivity. The wedding of a queen was meant to be a triumph. For her, it was the binding of chains. The cathedral of ceremony. The cathedral was filled with nobles and clergy, their eyes fixed upon the child bride. Incense thick in the air, candles flickered in golden rows, the choir's voices soared like angels. But Isabel heard only the pounding of her own heart. She walked slowly down the aisle, every step rehearsed, every glance choreographed. Porters watched, ambassadors scribbled, priests murmured. Her marriage was not for herself. It was for Christendom, for treaties, for the fragile peace between empires. A king twice her age at the altar stood. Philip Roman II of Spain, black-clad, solemn, 40 years old. His expression betrayed no tenderness, no hesitation. When Isabel looked up at him, she saw not a husband but a sovereign. His gaze was steady, his presence overwhelming, his silence louder than the choir's hymns. She was a girl, trembling before a man who was already legend. Vaz without a voice. The priest intoned the sacred words. Isabel repeated them as she had been instructed. Her voice was soft, almost swallowed by the cavernous church. Did she understand the vase? Perhaps not fully. But she knew enough. Her life, her body, her future, all pledged to a man she scarcely knew. There was no pause, no question, no chance for refusal. The ritual itself was her answer. Chains of gold. When the crown was placed upon her head, it gleamed like sunlight. The court rejoiced, the people cheered, the bells thundered across Madrid. But to Isabel, the crown was not gold. It was iron, heavy, unyielding, cold. Each jewel was another link in the chain, each prayer another lock, each cheer another nail sealing her fate. The banquet of masks that night, a grand banquet filled the palace. Tables groaned with delicacies, musicians played, courtiers toasted. Isabel sat beside Philip, her face a mask of composure. She smiled when required, bowed when expected, raised her cup at the right moments. But behind her mask, the child wept. She was celebrated as a bride, yet she felt herself a prisoner. Union for Nations chroniclers would later describe the wedding as magnificent, a union that brought peace between France and Spain. They praised Isabel's beauty, Philip's dignity, the grandeur of the day. But none recorded the truth, that a girl's childhood ended at the altar, and that the crown placed upon her head was not a gift, but a shackle. The wedding of chains. And so Isabel of Valois became Queen of Spain not by choice, not by love, but by treaty. Her wedding was no celebration. It was a ceremony of captivity, a ritual binding her to a stranger, a kingdom, an empire. The world saw gold and jewels. Isabel felt only chains. Part 12. Life in a cage. The chains had been fastened in the cathedral. Now they closed around her every day. To the world, Isabel was Queen of Spain. To herself, she was a bird locked inside a gilded cage. The architecture of captivity. The palace was vast, yet she could not walk freely through it. Each corridor, each garden, each chamber was marked by boundaries invisible but absolute. Everywhere she went, she was followed by attendants, by guards, by whispers. She could not step beyond a threshold without permission, could not open a window without eyes upon her. The walls were not stone alone. They were rules, customs, eyes that never closed. Ritual without rest. Her days were carved by ritual. At dawn, ladies in waiting assembled to dress her. At meals, courtiers observed her every movement. At prayer, confessors measured the depth of her devotion. The simplest act, lifting a cup, choosing a gown, offering a smile, became public. There was no space for error, no moment of solitude. Even her silence was interpreted, even her sighs were noted. The burden of expectation. Though still a child, she bore the weight of nations. France expected her loyalty. Spain demanded her obedience. Philip required her virtue, her patience, her silence. Above all, she was expected to give him an heir. A duty whispered in corridors, written in letters, prayed for by the court. The womb of a 14-year-old had become a question of empire. A husband's distance. Philip was not cruel, but neither was he kind. He was distant, grave, absorbed by the machinery of empire. He dined with ministers more often than with her.